In the spring of 1948, a boy named Fred Boyce walked into the Fernald State School in Massachusetts. He was 10 years old. His parents had left him there. The school was supposed to take care of him, educate him, give him a future. The building had windows, the staff wore uniforms. Everything looked official, everything looked safe. One day, a man in a white coat approached him. The man said Fred had been chosen for something special. He said Fred was going to join the science club. He said there would be trips to Red Sox games. He said that Fred was special. Well, Fred was not told what the science club actually was. He was not told that he would be fed radioactive cereal for breakfast. He was not told that the radioactive iron and calcium in that cereal would stay in his body forever, slowly releasing radiation directly into his organs. He was not told the MIT researchers had designed it that way. And he was not told that Quaker Oats had funded it to prove their product was better than cream of wheat.
Do you know why delicious hot Quaker Oats is so good for so many families?
He was not told any of that because the consent form said his parents had given permission. His parents had never seen the consent form. There was no phone call, there was no explanation, and the form only existed so the institution could later say that everything was legal. This is the story of the permission slip, the bureaucratic fiction that allowed 4 different countries to conduct deliberate experiments on children who lived in institutions whose parents had no power, whose voices could not reach the outside world. The children all had something in common. They were already abandoned. The institutions made sure they stayed that way. The Fernald State School was officially called the Massachusetts School for Feeble-Minded Boys. Boys lived there who had intellectual disabilities. Boys lived there who had been abandoned. Boys like Fred who had nowhere else to go. Between 1945 and 1956, researchers from MIT and Harvard University conducted a series of studies on 74 of them. They fed the boys Quaker Oats cereal laced with radioactive iron. They fed them milk laced with radioactive calcium. They wanted to understand how the human body absorbs minerals. The boys delivered that information by swallowing what amounted to internal radiation sources. Well, Fred noticed his breakfast tasted different sometimes. Nobody explained why. The science club members were told that they were special. They were told they were helping science. What they actually were was expendable. The radiation dose they received was equivalent to 30 chest x-rays each, concentrated directly inside their bodies. The researchers published their findings in scholarly journals. They never mentioned the boys by name. They never mentioned that no parent had ever actually consented. They never mentioned that the institution had used consent forms that parents had never seen. Fred did not find out what had been done to him until 1994 when he heard it on the radio, 50 years later. He spent 50 years walking around with radioactive material in his skeleton. MIT and Quaker Oats eventually settled a lawsuit. The payment was $1.85 million divided among all of the survivors. Fred got his share. The researchers who had conducted the studies, well, they didn't face any criminal charges. Across the Atlantic in Sweden, a different kind of experiment was taking place. At Vipeholm Hospital in Lund, patients with intellectual disabilities lived in what the government called facilities for the uneducatable retards. In 1945, the Swedish government commissioned a study. They wanted to understand why cavities were so common. They suspected sugar, but they had no proof. The researchers began with a reasonable experiment. They gave some patients extra vitamins. It made no difference to cavity formation, so in 1947, without government approval, and without telling anyone they were changing the experiment, they shifted to a new approach. They would deliberately cause cavities. They would feed the patients massive quantities of candy. Specifically, they would feed them extra sticky toffee, the kind that stuck to your teeth and stayed there. From 1947 to 1949, the patients ate between 8 and 24 pieces of candy at every meal. Not as treatment, as the experiment itself. The researchers documented everything. They watched the cavities form. They watched the teeth decay. By the time they started reducing the candy in 1949, 50 of the 660 patients at Vipeholm had their teeth completely destroyed. The teeth, as you know, did not grow back. The damage was permanent. The patients had to live with it. The researchers documented it scientifically and published the results in 1954, after 5 years of deliberation about whether they should publish it at all. The candy companies had pressured them to keep quiet because the results showed what everyone already suspected. But the Swedish parliament introduced a bill to end the experiment. The government prohibited using Vipeholm patients in research from 1955 onwards. One of the dentists involved defended the study decades later. He said the results were scientifically sound. He didn't mention the 50 people who would eat soft foods for the rest of their lives because, well, their teeth had been systematically destroyed in the name of proof. The guidelines for modern dental care still use Vipeholm's data. Every time a dentist recommends reducing sugar consumption, they are citing findings generated by deliberately rotting the teeth of people who couldn't say no. In New York, the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island held thousands of children with intellectual disabilities. The conditions were medieval. Robert Kennedy visited in 1965 and described it as a snake pit. A politician called it a snake pit. Children were locked in rooms. They were forced to sleep on floors covered in their own shit. They did not have enough to eat, and above all, they had hepatitis. The disease spread through the facility like fire. 40 to 50% of the children caught it. A man named Sol Krugman, a professor of epidemiology, saw the problem, and he had an idea. He would deliberately infect children with hepatitis so that he could study the virus and potentially develop a vaccine. The parents, well, they were told something a little bit different. They were told that their children would probably catch hepatitis anyway because of the conditions at Willowbrook. They were told that if they participated in the study, their children would get extra medical care. They were not told that participation meant their child would be deliberately infected. They were not told that the infection method involved feeding children shit-contaminated food of other infected patients. They were not told this because the consent forms were written so vaguely that the parents had no idea what they were actually agreeing to. From 1956 to 1972, Krugman and his team deliberately infected children to study the virus. Some of the children got sicker than expected, some nearly died. The study ended only because journalists and parents and lawyers eventually forced it to stop. In 1972, the year the hepatitis experiments officially ended, Sol Krugman was elected president of the American Pediatric Society. He received multiple prestigious awards. He received the Robert Koch Gold Medal. He received the Mary Woodard Lasker Public Services Award. None of the awards went to the children whose infected blood had generated the data that made him famous. The vaccinologist named Maurice Heilmann said the Willowbrook studies were the most unethical medical experiments ever performed on children in the United States. Krugman died of natural causes, never prosecuted, never imprisoned, never held accountable beyond the lawsuits that were settled with the families. In Quebec, the most audacious scheme of all unfolded in plain sight. Maurice Duplessis was the premier. The Roman Catholic Church ran the orphanages. An orphan child cost the provincial government 70 cents per day to support. A child certified as mentally ill cost the federal government $2.25 per day. Well, that maths was simple. So in the 1940s, Duplessis and the church began quietly reclassifying children. Healthy children, children with no psychiatric problems, they would stamp them with a fake diagnosis. Mentally deficient, mentally ill. They would move them from orphanages to psychiatric institutions. The province suddenly received far more money for those same children. Children who had been normal were now officially insane. There were no treatments for this insanity because there was no actual insanity. There was only money, and the children had to go somewhere. They went into asylums. They were locked away. The institution had them falsely certified and then had to maintain the lie because, well, the lie was so damn profitable. By the early 1960s, after Duplessis died, a government commission investigated the psychiatric hospitals. They found something astonishing. 1/3 of the 22,000 people classified as mentally ill had been classified that way purely for provincial financial benefit. They had no psychiatric disorder. They were just children. They were just orphans. They had just been born to unwed mothers and were already powerless. The system took that powerlessness and weaponized it. When the institutions finally released the children in the 1960s, they released people who had been traumatized, people who had been subjected to electric shock, people who had been given experimental drugs, people who had been physically and sexually abused. Released from asylums that they should never have been in, they had nowhere to go. Survivors did not speak about what happened to them for almost 30 years. It was not until the early 1990s that the Duplessis orphans began to tell their stories. In 1999, researchers calculated that the government and the church had made approximately $170 million in profits from the scheme. Well, the church denies any involvement, but survivors have spent decades fighting for compensation. I think Cat would be better off over here. See slidey table. Ha ha ha! There is something beneath all four of these stories that matter more than the specific experiments themselves. The permission slip exists because of a specific kind of powerlessness. The children who were experimented on lived in institutions. They had no parents present to protect them. They had no visitors. They had no lawyers. They had no way to contact the outside world. The institutions held complete control. The permission slip is the document that transforms that control into legality. It is the form that the powerful sign without ever asking the vulnerable. It is the bureaucratic tool that allows someone to say later that they tried to get consent, even though the person who supposedly gave consent never saw the form. They never understood it. They never agreed to anything. Fred Boyce walked out of Fernald in the 1950s carrying radioactive material in his body that he did not know was there. The patients at Vipeholm walked out of the hospital with destroyed teeth that they had done nothing to deserve. The children at Willowbrook recovered from the hepatitis they had been deliberately infected with, carrying the virus through their bodies for the rest of their lives. The Duplessis orphans walked out of an asylum that should never have held them, carrying the trauma of years, locked away for being the wrong kind of poor. The researchers published. The institutions moved on. The children carried the consequences. The permission slips sit in archives somewhere. Proof of nothing except that the powerful found a way to make the powerless responsible for their own harm.